Hello, everyone, and welcome. I see the numbers climbing here. Welcome. And welcome to the Elimination of Bias, Cognitive Distortions, and Bias Systems MCLE. Thank you all for being here today. We're expecting a great turnout. My name is Rianne from the San Diego Law Library, and we have the honor of having attorney Jim Eischen and Sandy Naranjo as our guest speakers today. So before we get started, I do want to go over a few bits of housekeeping. So first thing, this is a CLE presentation. And for those of you watching today, live today, you will get a certificate of attendance from the library by email once we verify who actually attended. If you are attending today's session via audio and you dialed in using the phone number on Zoom, please send us an email with your name, phone number, bar number, in order to receive MCLE credit today. Again, please only email us if you dialed in by using the audio function with your name, phone number, and bar number. You should have also received a handout for this presentation. If you did not receive it, please email the reference desk at info@sdlawlibrary.org. And also, if you are watching the recording of this video on YouTube, unfortunately, we do not provide a certificate for recordings, but you can access the self-study log on the State Bar's website, and there is also a link in the description box below. Okay, so back to those of you watching live on Zoom today. This is an interactive session, and you can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see the icon with a speech bubble. Under the Q&A function, you can ask questions with your name or anonymously, whichever you feel more comfortable with. And we do hope to get to most of the questions by the end of the presentation. And finally, at the end of the class today, you will see a link to a survey. So if you can, please just take a moment to fill it out. We greatly appreciate your feedback. Well, all right, that's all I have. I'm going to turn things over to Jim.
Thank you so much, Rianne, and thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation. You know, I got my start in speaking on professional burnout and mental competency because the San Diego Law Library reached out to me about, gosh, I want to say 12 years ago, and asked me to repeat a presentation I did on professional burnout for Cal Western Law School. And by you guys recording me and putting me online, next thing I know, I had the New York Attorney General's office asking me to give them guidance on burnout. So I want to say thank you to the San Diego Law Library for coming back again. And I hope today will be another noteworthy chapter in our collaboration. Before I move forward, let me introduce my partner and also someone who works with me professionally, Sandy Naranjo. She's going to be, she participated in the assembly of these materials importantly, and I want to let her give a brief bio of herself, and then I'll give you my brief bio, and then we'll get going.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Naranjo. As Jim mentioned, I am his partner, and I also work at Eischen Law Office. And just a background of me, I am a native of San Diego. I was born and raised in San Isidro. I attended California State University of San Bernardino. I earned 3 bachelor's degrees in honors in political science, economics, and political economy with a minor in women's studies. I also co-founded my own consulting company called Eischen Consulting. With that, I've co-founded a nonprofit called High Ambition Climate Collective. My passion is around environmental justice and climate justice, and I've authored a book called How to Integrate Equity and Environmental Justice into Port Real Estate Leasing Practices. I was a former port commissioner trying to elevate racial justice, environmental justice, social justice, and economic justice into port policy. And back to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. So you can see why she's here. My name is Jim Eischen. I've been an attorney for 36 years. And as I mentioned briefly with my conversation with Rian, I really fell into this area backwards without expectations. So I was a corporate and real estate attorney in San Diego minding my own business, and just by accident attended a conference on concierge medicine in Scottsdale, Arizona. Sort of spoke up about what I thought was perhaps a misallocation of regulatory risk. Next thing I knew, I was asked to speak on that topic for their next conference in New York, which was not my expectation or my plan. And then really by accident became a national expert in innovative cash healthcare systems, how to put them together, how to structure them to be compliant under federal laws. I do the work throughout the US, so it's predominantly a federal law compliance challenge. Occasional state law issues, not much. And I was speaking regularly around the country on healthcare professionals trying to do something a little different than the way insurance plans package healthcare. When I was asked as a partner at Higgs Fletcher and Mack, gee, you do those talks on healthcare, could you do a talk on mental competency for Cal Western? I did it about 12 years ago. I thought oddly it took off. I'm not an expert in this, nor did I think I'd ever get any business. No one's going to hire me to be a burnout lawyer. So I just did it to do it for community service. Law Library finds me, records the same talk for their model. Next thing you know, the Georgia State Prosecutors Council, the New York Attorney General's Office, and other organizations have me speak to them on professional burnout and mental competency. Okay. So I start doing that. Eventually, I do that for the state bar as a volunteer speaker, which I do basically on a pro bono basis. And so you can see where things are going here, right? So I'm in this cash healthcare space, which for 14 years requires me to really study US healthcare very closely. Now, somewhat ironically, this is a healthcare system that I would argue is for the wealthy. In other words, it's really people with means that are hiring concierge, functional medicine, even direct primary care practices to do additional innovative care outside of plan. So why am I here? So I started realizing that the country was deeply confused about everything I was talking about. And at first I took it personally, like maybe I'm a really ineffective presenter, which is why all these healthcare consultants look slack-jawed next year, asking me the same questions that I covered in a talk. I'm like, okay, or why don't other healthcare law firms around the country fully understand what I'm doing? I wrote the chapter on this for the California Medical Association Physician Legal Desk book. I go around the country and talk about this. Why is this so confusing? Well, I got over myself and I thought, well, maybe it's not me at all. And then I started wondering, why do entrepreneurs who come into healthcare act with such confusion? I tell them what the laws are, try to let them know how to get 10 yards and a first down in the US healthcare system. And it's constantly confusing. That caught my attention. Meanwhile, as I did professional burnout talks locally, sometimes around the country, I got really heavily involved in cognitive distortion analysis. Cognitive distortions are the ways in which our brain trick us. And you're probably familiar with really basic versions of this, like quote unquote black and white thinking, or confirmatory bias. In other words, filtering information to only hear what supports your opinion or thinking. Well, I got really into that because it became a big part of my talks on burnout. And the antidote to that, in my opinion, was curiosity and mindfulness. So I got into that. And so then I start thinking about a bias as a topic. And about 3 years ago, I did an elimination of bias presentation for a national platform. And I, on my own, connected these dots. I said, not with healthcare per se, but that I think bias could be a cognitive distortion. It's just our brain misfiring, drawing on the wrong categorizations, leading to the wrong conclusions. It was really just a theory of mine. And I did this one talk and nothing really came of it. But then as I worked harder and harder in the healthcare side of things, Sandy and I found together and organized presentation materials on what we thought was at the root of the US healthcare system confusion. It's a gentleman by the name of Frederick Kaufman, which we're going to talk about Frederick. And then by contrast, there was an ancient over 100 years old version of healthcare that was at the heart of the executive health model that seemed to be doing so well for the privileged and protected legally. So in the innovative side of healthcare that I do, I had made this connection between the US system's aberrations and confusion that might actually tie back to some really errant thinking that we don't really want to look in the mirror and look at too hard, do we? So I'm going to try to talk you into that by the cost factor. I may not get you with fairness, maybe some of you with fairness, some of you not. So I'm going to talk to some of you based on pure cost and economic theory as to why this is just really bad stuff. So that's where I got really firm about cognitive distortions intersecting with bias and intersecting with the healthcare system. And then we all saw the United Health assassination, the CEO killed. And as noteworthy as that is, what's even more noteworthy to me is the social media reactions and the media reaction. Look at those reactions. It's not very sensitive to the assassinated executive and his family, right? There's this deep welling of anger over the healthcare system and what it does to us and how it treats or mistreats us. And I want to tap into that today. So you can see where I'm taking a lot of roads and centralizing it to one place. So we're going to talk about elimination of bias today. And this is exactly what we're going to cover. So first of all, we're going to touch on our legal obligations as attorneys. Now, Sandy's not an attorney, but she's been around a few. So we're going to talk about what the legal obligations are for us as licensed attorneys, just to start. Well, let's call it laying a foundation. Then we're going to shift today to talk about what is bias. You know, now that we know that we're supposed to not do it, what is it? And we're going to talk a little bit about how bias and cognitive distortion theory may intersect. And we have the great privilege of actually hearing indirectly from a national expert on this who has far more personal experience than I do as an African-American PhD graduate of Harvard, Dr. Eckbart. But we're gonna look at her book on bias and see how she connected those dots, which I thought was really cool. I guess that was confirmation bias. And then we're going to shift to what approaches might eliminate bias as a cognitive distortion. Good news, bad news. I have for you. Good news is there are things you can do. Bad news, this is a lifelong problem. Okay, our brains never really function entirely factually or accurately. We never quite turn the corner for all sorts of reasons beyond today's talk, I think. But we're going to talk about what are some things that we can do about it. And then finally, we're going to land with a flourish. We're going to talk about the US healthcare system. And we're going to use this as a beta or as a way to look at what the cost of bias might actually be. We can all look at articles that talk about numbers and say, this costs us $1 billion a year or whatnot, but it can be quite abstract. So what I'm going to try to deliver for you today, based on my experience in the US healthcare system and my own work, and Sandy and our research for other presentations, is what we discovered about the US healthcare system, which I found to be actually quite shocking. And we can make the cost look very hard and real, and maybe talk a few folks out of doing healthcare the same way we're doing it for economic reasons. It's also fair, but you know, let's talk about money too. So first, let's talk about what the law requires of us. So these are things that I'm very certain you already know. That, for example, you have an MCLE requirement that includes the elimination of bias, which we're going to get that done today. You know, California rules of court, rules of professional conduct. I'm sure it's not a surprise to you that there's some general admonitions about exhibiting bias. And we know this. And I'm just pointing out to you that as a license issue, it's an important thing. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, no matter what your belief systems are or are not, no matter what your personal life story is and what your connection is or isn't with this topic, we all share in common a professional obligation to navigate it correctly. So we need to do that. States have a whole variety of anti-discrimination laws that, no surprise, did not start in the 1890s or 1920s. Maybe didn't really get going till the mid to late 1960s, based on American history. But nonetheless, we have some laws on the books against discrimination and against bias. And we have those laws because, folks, it really did happen. I hope I'm not surprising anybody. Model ABA rules definitely incorporate bias as a matter of professional misconduct, not teethily binding on us from a licensure perspective, but worthy of note from a national perspective that this is sort of our collective legal profession's observation that we need to avoid this bias thing, which we'll talk about what that is in a moment. And even for judges, judges are also under admonition not to engage in bias on any level. So there are a variety of federal laws. Again, if you look at the years they were passed, you can note that this was not an old thing, and this is not where the US was from a legal or cultural perspective before then. But after the 1960s, we engaged in a concerted effort nationally to try to address some obvious and very plainly seen problems that existed in our country historically. And there's a variety of these federal laws. And it's just simply worth noting that the EEOC is today actively monitoring and investigating such matters, particularly focused on labor. And labor is where a lot of this happens because, let's face it, the American culture, much of our life is work life. I mean, if you just look at the hours that we work and how we live our lives, when Americans meet each other, what do they say? What do you do for a living? It's not like, who's your favorite philosopher, and tell me your favorite movie, and what's your favorite food? I mean, I guess some of you do that, and if you do, that's amazing. But it seems like in America, we often talk about what we do for work. And if you look at our culture and how we live, literally, just the hours of the day that we spend on different things, sleep and work are most of it. I mean, that's just a fact. So just a couple other comments about paying attention. And just to call out what we know to be true, which is there is an anti-DEI backlash going on in the country right now. And if you did not know that, I'm here to tell you. If you did know that, you knew it. And there's serious pockets of population in the United States that do not want to see DEI mandates, and they have reasons for that. So it's an interesting thing to note where we are as a culture right now. We are really, just like this presentation, right? All these roads have led to this place, so we're at a place where, from a national election perspective, clearly a majority of voters took a different direction. Okay. And they did. And no one's questioning that. But it's a little bit of a mix, still, when you look at the voting trends, it's interesting. It's very interesting. You can see that DEI was really gathering steam and then seemed to run into a wall. And now, from a cultural perspective, diversity, equity, and inclusion is almost a dirty word in corporations that maybe 2 years ago had a department and someone in charge of making that happen. And now that's not necessarily a universally embraced notion in America's corporate culture. Interesting to note. Here we are. And then finally, the assassination of the United Health executive in New York by who we now know who it is, the assassin, has triggered an incredible amount of media on the US healthcare system and its data, what it does wrong, the anger, the deep-seated anger of people that's leading to basically celebrating the assassin. I'm not passing judgment on any of that, but simply observing, look what's happening. So this is an interesting moment to kind of take a look at all of that and to talk about eliminating bias, because there's definitely some force vectors going in different directions. And so we're going to look at that. And finally, just to note that bias is not just becoming something that lawyers have to avoid. It's also creeping its way into the healthcare profession with requirements with respect to education and also conduct. So this is an interesting time. So let's dive in. Now, I'm a white privileged male. Let's just call it out. I have Jewish background. So the level of bias that I have experienced in my life is not tangible. Okay, not worthy of discussion or even mention. And I'm glad for Sandy Naranjo to be in this talk, because I believe at times she can speak from personal experience in a way that I can't. What are my stories? They're kind of dumb. But like, for example, I was 5 years old growing up in Chula Vista. My mom and dad were very devoutly Catholic and they had opinions. And I remember going to a little boy's house and having the best time with this little boy. And I couldn't understand why my mom never let me go back. He was African American. And it was a little bit of a mystery to me my whole life. I was a basketball player and I was pretty good. I was supposed to play D1 college ball and I had a back injury. So I wasn't bad for a local kid. And I played a lot of ball at the Chula Vista Rec Center and I went to St. Augustine High School when that high school was not really so privileged and was much more racially diverse than it is today. And I know that because I coached their high school surf team. I helped coach it. So I've seen the changes. And so I had the privilege of being around a lot of people from a lot of different cultures as a kid, but I also had experiences of, frankly, bias. And I find that interesting as I look toward my life today. Dr. Jennifer Eberhard's story is absolutely incredible and personal. And I highly recommend, if anyone's curious about this subject at all, to read her book. It was a pretty quick read, I'll tell you, but it was so insightful, like her story and her journey. And I love her humility. The story she tells about her little son, who's himself exhibiting some evidence of bias, and her son's story and her story, supposedly to carry the flag of Harvard at a commencement and was like really under questionable circumstances arrested by the Boston police, cuffed, slammed to her car, and then dragged to Boston jail. The only way she got out of jail to carry that Harvard flag was because the dean of her school called the police and they were let go. And then the charges were dropped. She was charged with assault and battery of a police officer because apparently she put a finger on the police officer's hand as he forcibly extracted her from her car. Okay. So Dr. Eberhard's journey as someone who has studied profoundly bias and psychological social conditions of bias, her credibility is light years beyond me. And so for that reason, I commend you to her. But we want to talk about what she had to say. Now, what excited me is that Dr. Eberhard came to a conclusion that felt very resonant with me. And that is, she started with the notion of bias as beginning with categorization. And then she took it from categorization to confirmation bias. This is cognitive distortions. And so for me, having studied that subject, autodidactically for 14 years, I had a real aha moment reading her book and seeing an expert in this subject, both on a personal level and academically at a very high level, seeing that bias is really, it's a brain misfire. So let's take a look at what she thinks bias is. We label the beliefs about social groups as stereotypes and the attitudes we have about them as prejudice. Whether good or bad, whether justified or unjustified, beliefs and attitudes become so strongly associated with a category that they create automatic triggers. So we see certain things and we just go, oh, I know what that is. That can be bias. And then when she talks about categorization, that's sort of the precursor. It's a universal function of all human brains that is allowing us to organize and store and manage constant stimuli. So think about it as a human, as a hunter-gatherer. And I'm going to draw from Jared Diamond's history of people. I love Jared Diamond as an anthropologist. He wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. He also wrote a very thick book that I did read on the history of human tribal behaviors. And Dr. Diamond talks about how he discovered, for example, in New Guinea, that New Guineans would avoid ever camping next to a tree. And it was really just because, from his study, there was one instance of a tree falling and killing a family. And that story lived 1,000 years and caused their behaviors to modify on a nearly permanent basis. Dr. Eberhard tells the story of her and her husband driving unwisely, she would say, because they're driving in a country and where it's the other side of the road. And she just thought it was so remarkably dangerous because their brains had been so curved into driving the way we do in America on the right side that they literally nearly died because, and it's the same thing. It's that notion that our brains are categorizing and cheating to basically allow us to think about other things. So our brains are just going, oh, I know what that is. And then we can put that in a box and never think about it again and allocate our oxygen and our energy resources and our calories to something else that's more of a challenge. This is the beginning of bias. And then implicit bias is what she says is a distorting lens that basically applies that mischaracterization or that characterization to something happening now. So that, Sandy, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I know you worked on this too. Do you think Dr. Eberhardt's getting this right?
Yes. And the example she gave on, categorization, it's, the example she talked about apples, like, when can we eat an apple? Do you cook an apple? Where does it grow? And so it's just an example of how our brains work. And so when we apply it to, on a racial, with the racial lens, our brains make those associations again by like what society tells us of like how people live, and also too of how we interact with different communities. And so again, it's like seeking that confirmation bias, and because of how our brains are wired.
Yeah, I thought she was absolutely persuasive on this. So let's kick forward. This can surprise our brains and surprise us, and we don't see it. And so this actually refers to a study that was done in which we simply started correlating reactions to resumes based on names that were more or less plainly African American. And you can already know the answer to that study, which was that the having an apparently African American name caused there to be a different and more negative response to resumes. And I have my own experience anecdotally with this. I was in a large firm that will remain unnamed, and I was a young associate, and I was involved in hiring a paralegal for our team. And I saw a resume, and I saw this person was really, in my opinion, working this happened to be female, working her way up. And I thought she might be African American, but I didn't know. And I definitely wanted to meet her because I had a different wiring. Okay. Like from my perspective and my life experiences, my hunch is that this person was going to be exceptional because my hunch was this is someone who's overcome some things. So sure enough, I interviewed her and I gave her like if there was a star system, I gave her 5 out of 5 stars. I just thought smart, successful, overcame obstacles, winner. And my strongest recommendation was to hire, which was ignored completely. And I was confused. And then I was told by a mid-level associate, oh, that supervising partner will never hire a Black person. And I just remember that was a moment for me because, we don't want to see this. We really don't. I think most of us want to say, oh, it's over. It's not happening anymore. And this was a while ago, admittedly, but it really took me by surprise. It kind of took my breath away, and I didn't know what to do about it. I eventually left. This is something I want us to talk about for a moment. And I'm going to put this under the topic of bias is confusing. And bias can go directions where you don't even know where to begin or how to even talk about it. So I don't know if you're aware of the Emilia Perez movie, but it's getting some attention and it's on Netflix. And I believe it is a Cannes Film Festival award winner. And man, interesting movie. It's directed by a French director. It's a French movie. It's set in Mexico. Okay. And the storyline goes that a Mexican cartel leader, a ruthless and fearless leader, is going to transition from being a man to a woman. And he is going to get out of the game. He is married to a Mexican woman who allegedly comes from very humble Mexican roots and has 2 children, and enlists the services of a African American Mexican lawyer in Mexico City played by Zoe Saldana. And that comes up, that she gets underappreciated for her legal work. And one may infer that it could have a racial or gender component. But this cartel leader finds her, basically kidnaps her, and then has her in charge of his transition process and managing money and managing the transition of all of this. Lots of transition. So Sandy and I watched this movie. And one of the things that we had known about before we saw the movie is that Selena Gomez was selected to play the wife of the cartel leader. Now, Selena Gomez was raised in America and apparently is not a fluent Spanish speaker. But nonetheless, in the movie, she speaks Spanish. And according to Spanish lingual experts, which I am not, she does a very poor job. Okay. And in fact, in the movie, she breaks into English on occasion, which left me very confused. And I don't even speak good Spanish. I am very rudimentary. And I could tell that that didn't sound right. And I couldn't figure it out. Like, is this supposed to be, is this the director's vision? Is this a twist? Like, oh, look, she doesn't really speak good Spanish, or was this just a total mistake? And then the director of, Sandy, what is the name of that series we love so much on Apple? Acapulco.
Yes.
Okay. The director of Acapulco, who is Mexican, Spanish fluent, Spanish speaking, came out in the press and said Selena Gomez's Spanish accent is, I believe the word he used was indefensible. So we knew that. We watched the movie and we both, Sandy and I both agreed, like, yeah, indefensible. When that Acapulco director was quoted in the media on this, he was on threat of cancellation and he walked it back and said, well, no, I'm gonna, no, Selena did a wonderful job. I apologize for making that comment. And Selena Gomez has had her own medical conditions. She's had a medical journey. Selena Gomez of today is not Selena Gomez of 10 years ago. To be commended for her perseverance, but perhaps not for her Spanish dialect. And then from my perspective, I had started learning French because I'm a dual citizen of the US and Luxembourg because my great-grandfather was born in Luxembourg. So I decided to apply for lineal citizenship and I got it. So as part of that process, I decided to work on French, and because French is the official language of Luxembourg. All right. So getting to know French for a while, I can tell you this: the French are not tolerant of incorrect pronunciation at all, at all. And in fact, it's a thing in France itself, whether you have a Parisian accent or a non-Parisian accent, and it's much more elegant and acceptable to have a Parisian accent. And you sound a little bit like a hick if you don't. So if your accent is more Caribbean or rural French, that is not considered amazing or wonderful. And when you watch French language television, which I have, literally on a daily basis, there is a lesson for the country of France on an aspect of French grammar and pronunciation every day on their national station. So this French director, who no doubt is well aware of France's sensitivity to its own pronunciation, is nonetheless in Mexico, doesn't speak Spanish, has Selena Gomez massacring the Spanish language, and goes with it. And that's a wrap. So, Sandy, tell me your thoughts about this. I'm curious as to where you come from on this story.
Yeah, and I just want to add a correction, Jim, is that Zoe Saldana's character, she's Dominican Republic that lives in Mexico City, who's a lawyer. So,
Got it.
The layers of being Black, Latina. But what I do want to add is it's about, language is power. And so me growing up, I grew up in San Isidro, it's a border town, and my Spanish is bocha. And as Jim mentioned, giving the example of how, French and how you have to speak it properly and how you're judged if you don't speak it with a certain accent. You can see that, in other languages, and especially, if you are Mexican and you grew up in America, and if you're Spanish is, I mean, you're called pocha or pocho. So it's not necessarily an empowering term. A lot of folks have made it empowering just because it's like, hey, this is the way I speak. So what's interesting, I didn't know about the movie. I only knew about the backlash because I'm a big fan of Eugenio Derbez. I used to watch him. He did a lot of telenovelas in Mexico. His popularity came from Mexico before he made it big in the US. And so at first, at the surface, I thought, okay, I'm glad he apologized because it is, it is a sensitive topic, especially, if you're always criticized for the way you speak. And that's something that I'm very sensitive about. But if you look at cinema, and I've taken classes on cinematography. The thing about cinema is that it has to be believable. And so if you look at the film, again, the film is based in Mexico. The film, the character, Selena's character is someone who grew up poor in Mexico. Someone who grew up poor in Mexico um, is not going to speak Spanish with some English words. That's someone like that I grew like me. Like I would speak Spanish and I'll break in English. A lot of my friends do the same thing, family members. So it is in a way in the cinema world, and what Eugenio is really trying to say is that, you know, for the film, and because it is showcasing Mexico, and because there are so many actresses that could sing and could speak Spanish, that it is indefensible, and
Yeah,
that
it is.
and the very fact that also what folks don't know is that in movies there's always a dialect coach to help you. And Selena, what a lot of people don't talk about is Selena actually in an interview said, I could have done better. And
Yeah.
it just goes back to what Eugenio, and what the other part that was missed after he said her Spanish is defensible, he said because it's a French musical, even though it is in Spanish and it's based in Mexico, it's like the French didn't care that the Spanish didn't align of where the movie took place.
And they would never have allowed a French movie to have an American actress, for example, speak really bad French. They watch, like with Timothy Chalamet, they listen, and I've actually seen social media posts where they go, it's not bad. Like this is okay, this is wrong, this is okay, this is wrong. So we need to move on for time, but I want to highlight how confusing bias can be, because here we are talking about a movie with its own interesting topic, with multiple layers of different nationalities and different interests involved, and look at how messed up it can get. And what's at the heart of it is, I think, we don't see reality very clearly. So I just have a few slides to talk about basic what to look for, but I'm just going to go to the bottom. We're looking for facts. Now, we know that we don't see facts clearly. Every practicing attorney has deposed someone who, under oath, misremembers, says something self-serving, can't seem to remember the same conversations that three other witnesses under oath remember. So as attorneys, we know that reality is disputed. And as Americans, we know reality is heavily disputed. And those disputes are happening every day in the news, in left-wing news, in right-wing news, in middle news. So when we look at when do we see bias happening, I make a bunch of references here. It really boils down to facts. I want to shift quickly to history. Now, the nice thing about history is it's over. We still debate it, right? Can't agree on those facts either. But there's some things we know, like we know there was segregational land use planning in America. We know the federal government blacklined and didn't allow African Americans to get federally insured home loans in certain neighborhoods. We know this. I was a licensed California real estate broker for 10 years because I helped manage a small portfolio of real estate for my family. And when I took the test for the broker's license, we actually had to know this history quite well. And I studied it, and it dropped my jaw, like the paralegal hiring experience. Outcome discrepancies. We know for a fact that the US has a far higher incarceration rate than any other country in the world. And we know that in our incarceration rates, we are stupendously incarcerating brown people to a max degree. Those are numbers. Now, we can all have a story we tell ourselves as to why that is, but those are inexplicable facts for us to consider. And then we're going to talk about the healthcare system, which I'm not sure people think of when they think of this issue, but there is definitely a tie-in. There's an intersection. So I wish bias was something we could talk about from a purely moral perspective and just say it's just the wrong thing to do. But the fact of the matter is that the functions of bias in our brains are constantly at work. And they're not always with respect to race or gender or a protected class. It's just the way our brains are wired. And this seems to be permanent. There may be ways that we can mitigate it and address it, but the notion that we can somehow eradicate it would require a substantial evolutionary leap that we do not appear to be at this present time. And it's expensive. So I'm going to focus a little bit on cost. So where are we at right now in this talk? There's a challenge. Clearly, there's facts out there that suggest that bias is a problem, and we have our own professional obligation not to do that, whatever that is. From an expert on this, we know what bias looks like, both from her own anecdotal stories and from her long-term studying from an academic perspective. Is cognitive distortion a root cause? I think it is. And how do we see this? How do we see clearly? I'm a French director directing Emilia Perez. I'm not going to see Selena Gomez's butchering of the Spanish language because I'm not ready for it. It's not in my brain. It's not a pattern that's been categorized. And what practical steps can we do? So let's move quickly into cognitive distortion theory. Where does this cognitive distortion thing come from? Let me give you a very short story. Two Jewish psychologists were both in their early parts of their career, and for different reasons and under different circumstances, were both hired to do research on human function. And one, notably, Danny Kahneman, was hired by the IDF to enhance the performance of Jewish fighter pilots in their missions against Arab countries in the earlier part of their many wars against their neighbors. And Danny Kahneman approached this with his background as a PhD in psychology and did experiments on how to try to create efficacy for Jewish fighter pilots, or I should say Israeli. And he came to the conclusion that it didn't matter. What a brave conclusion, you know. In other words, the guy could have made a lot of money if he came up with alleged ways to, enhance performance, but he honestly called it. He said that it didn't matter what they did. They either succeeded or failed, and there was no apparent pattern. But that made Danny Kahneman curious. And he found another psychologist doing similar studies by the name of Amos Tversky. And for decades, Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman collaborated. Sometimes they worked individually, but mostly together on doing psychological experiments with humans to see what is the nature of our judgment and why do we get things wrong. And they ended up publishing several notable studies on how our human minds come to the wrong conclusions fairly predictably. And this is really at the heart of what we think of in cognitive distortion theory. Now, what did those two win the Nobel Peace Prize for? Economics. Because what they proved is that humans are irrational with money. Wow. Like both not surprising, but kind of surprising. If you ever studied economics, you were taught that the one thing you could count on is that people will be rational with money. Au contraire. So these are some examples of cognitive distortions. They're going to look familiar to you. You know, when you look at the news and you read and experience the political debates our country seems to endlessly engage in, with much more speaking and far too little listening, you know what's happening. There's filtering going on. Some information we just ignore, doesn't fit our worldview. Or we intake all the information that goes our way and we ignore the stuff that doesn't go our way. This can also be something that we experience personally as attorneys in many different ways. For example, we'll often claim credit for a trial victory okay, there was probably a lot of factors, we're one of them. We often feel terrible when we lose at trial. I think most of the time, our primary job is to get the evidence in, and then it's other people making decisions. We can be really good at what we do, but other people are calling those shots, those balls and strikes. But how much do we take it personally? Sometimes in our careers, we tend to think of it very positively, but how often is it negative? And we compare ourselves economically or professionally to other people and get very unhappy that we're not where we want to be in our career, or we're not doing the kind of law that we wish we could be doing, or we don't have quite the work environment that we wish we had. Cognitive distortions have a role to play in how we process reality. And Tversky and Kahneman were right. We get it wrong a lot of the time. And these are just some observations I've had that I link to the bias, the labeling, the categorization. I actually wrote this slide 3 years ago before I read Dr. Eberhardt, and I suspect Dr. Eberhardt agrees. She frames it in a very similar way. And so why do we have these confirmation biases or these categorizations? Again, Dr. Eberhardt says this far more persuasively than I do, but to me, these are the availability heuristic, the fact that we just have information thrown at us and we go, zip, we're in it. Confirmation bias, our desire to get things right and ignore other information, and stereotyping, which we all do a lot. By contrast, mindfulness can be curative. And what is mindfulness? It's simply trying to look at reality from a neutral position. Think of it this way. What is the judicial temperament that we were all taught at some point in our career we strive toward? The judicial temperament is that you're not a homer, okay? You're not waving a flag for anything. Theoretically, you're listening to all the evidence, applying the law to those facts, look for good policy, and come up with a decision that's wise and just. That's a judicial temperament in theory. And that's really what mindfulness is too, is learning to slow down and without picking sides early, take in all the information and make better decisions. And whether that's driving without getting angry, or career advancement without unnecessarily making enemies, or that's what we're looking at. And so this really has an application to bias. How do we find bias? We have to look at facts without waving a flag, whatever that flag is. I don't care what your flag is. Have whatever flag you want. But whatever that flag is, we got to set the flag down and start looking at facts with a more neutral mindset, take a breath, and see if the combination of our two systems of thinking, which Danny Kahneman persuasively writes about, system one, system two, slow, linear, fast, intuitive, you got to have both. Applying both to the facts, we can do a little bit better. I'm going to move quickly because we're running out of time, but these are some mindfulness principles that I commend you to. You'll get the slide deck. I want to note curious. I think that's key. While Danny Kahneman and Tversky never really wrote a book called How to Solve Our Problem, they just conclusively wrote of the problem, which, by the way, I think Dr. Eberhardt did too. She conclusively establishes the problem. I'm not sure she knows what the answer is, and I don't think I do either. But Julia Galef's book on the scout mindset, the whole idea that we have to approach reality from a point of curiosity, is key. Now, in 2 minutes or 3, if I can pull this off, healthcare. I'm laughing at myself. So let me try to make this quick. In 1888 Germany, a right-wing politician who had no interest in liberalism, no interest in liberal thinking, not a socialist, didn't like socialism, created a nonprofit healthcare insurance model. Why? Because he wanted to wall off those damn socialists and those agitating workers in Germany who in 1888 were pretty effectively organizing against his theory of government. So that's where the German healthcare system comes from. It wasn't a bunch of hippies in a VW van going, dude, this is so cool. Not even close. Not even close. But by contrast, where was America in 1888 and 1896? We were Frederick Hoffman, and I'm afraid we still are. So just really quickly, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduces the national non-profit healthcare insurance system. So by the way, when you hear about different countries and their healthcare systems, it's still insurance. It's all insurance. Worldwide, all of those systems you love or hate are insurance. It's all insurance, okay? It's all insurance. The question is, what kind of insurance? Is it for-profit? Is it not for profit? Is it 50 little countries called the United States? 50 systems? Is it one system? Okay. All right. Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro is published by Frederick Hoffman in 1896 to rave reviews. Now, I read this book and I had to take a hot shower because what this guy's saying is that everyone other than Aryans, which he describes as white people, are destined to die because they're inferior. And so the US healthcare system should not waste its money on making everyone well. No, don't waste your money. We can solve the black problem, which is what he calls it, by simply not investing public money resources into US healthcare, unlike the Germans, and let them die. And in this book, he doesn't confine himself to African Negroes, although the title of his book is The African Negro. Oh, he goes to everybody. Haitians, Jamaicans, indigenous people, basically everyone else. So this 5'6", sickly German who immigrated from Germany because he couldn't serve in the military because he was physically incapable of doing so, who happened to be kind of a math genius, but also a devoutly racist person, combined his mathematical genius with racism and published in 1896 persuasively to an American culture that you shouldn't waste your money on brown and poor people. Let them die. Let them die. So if you go fast forward to the 1920s, you would think maybe Frederick Hoffman had subsided in influence. Oh, no. No, he's considered a national expert in healthcare in America. He's the founder of the American Cancer Society. Did you know that? So Frederick Hoffman was hired by for-profit insurance in America to be their national spokesperson. That's their guy in 1920s America to persuade Americans not to do the healthcare system that Germany does, not-for-profit centralized insurance, and instead do divided 50-state for-profit insurance like United Health. Okay, so Frederick Hoffman's your United Health guy. I mean, the precursor of United Health, Frederick Hoffman persuaded us that the German system was a bad idea. It had problems. He traveled over there and he lied about it, and Americans swallowed it. Even though at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, our hero president, was openly saying we should consider Germany's system. So I'm going to run through this quickly because we are short on time, but I think you know this story. So did you know the US healthcare system is $4.8 trillion? Well, that's some money. 92% of Americans have health insurance as of 2023. And it's a combination in America of for-profit private insurance like United Health, and about a third to almost a half of Americans are on a federal system, again, insurance. And those insurance systems are called Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare predominantly aimed at retirees, 65 and older, or any age, permanent disability. Medicaid, 50 state rolled out and based on poverty or income levels. 8% of Americans in 2023 had zero healthcare insurance coverage, which meant they had zero availability of healthcare resources. It's interesting to note that in 2022, almost 50% of all births in the US were funded by Medicaid. A lot of people don't know that. So what's happening in the US healthcare system that leads to this assassination and then unbelievable reaction to it of anger and celebration of the murderer is that Americans face constant out-of-network cost, constant copayment cost, constant denials of coverage. And we have 100 million Americans in this country affected by medical debt. Think about that number for a second. Okay, don't be a fairness person. Don't be nice, okay? Be a dispassionate economics person. Be a person who only cares about capitalism and your own prosperity. How do you benefit from 100 million Americans not able to buy your stuff? 100 million Americans who can't buy your goods and services because they have medical debt that's frustrating their lives and their economic prosperity. How does that help you? How is that helping you? I don't think it's helping you at all. I think it's hurting you. I think your country is in massive debt, a huge deficit. And even though we have the world's largest economy, at least they say, and I believe it, we also have a lot of economic problems, which in part describes the latest presidential election, does it not? So imagine that in this country, the number one cause of bankruptcy is medical debt. How is bankruptcies helping business? Again, I'm not caring about people. I don't care to be compassionate. I don't really want to be nice. What if I'm just a selfish capitalist pig? Don't I care about this? I think I should. I make this point. Breaking Bad, I don't know if you saw it. I loved it. And Better Call Saul. But in what other country on this planet could you have the following storyline? A high school chemistry teacher has a serious form of cancer, and in order to get the cancer treatment that he needs to possibly survive, he has to cook and then eventually sell meth and become a drug lord. Tell me another country where that storyline works. None. This is you. This is us. So I'm going to really quickly go over data where our healthcare system is twice more expensive than the rest of the world, maybe 3 times. And we're ranked somewhere between 50th and 69th in the world for public health outcomes. We're choking ourselves to death, folks. That's what we're doing. And this is not, Frederick Hoffman got the math wrong. He thought that some people could be the winners, but then the losers would just die off and go extinct. That's not happening. It's making us all go broke. So this is a failed math model. And it started with Frederick Hoffman. And he was a devout racist. The most pernicious and worst version called scientific racism. And then here, just to point out, here we are again, that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy than a white woman in America. And then when you take Americans in general, we are more likely to die, than other countries. So what is going on? So here's where I want to conclude and solicit Sandy's comments and yours too. I think the US healthcare system is a direct concept that arose from racism. I'm sorry, but I've done the work, I've done the research. Sandy and I, we've read the books, we've done the history work. It's pretty damn conclusive. And if you want to read Race Tendencies of the American Negro, go for it. I've got a copy of the book in my house. That's where our healthcare system comes from. Medicare's 80-20 coverage. So if you don't have the 20%, you're going to die. Medicaid's only based on income. If you're really poor, maybe you can get it. And if you do get it, it's not reimbursed very well. And then you have to have a job, because if you don't have a job, you're not worth living. So we're not going to pay for you not to have a job, because you got to have skin in the game. So you have skin in the game. So you're in the Hunger Games and you got a job, great. But how much are we restricting the flow of labor by having such an employer-centric healthcare system out of pocket with massive cash costs, which mean the poor are going to die? I don't think that's an accident. I think Frederick Hoffman, he saw that and he wrote a book about it, and we're still doing it. So oh shoot, sorry guys. So let's talk about bias. Bias is stereotypical thinking. We have to work toward mental clarity. We have an unchecked legacy of in healthcare that's right in our faces right now. Between bankruptcy, medical debt, the assassination of the United Health's CEO, and our reaction to it, we are seeing in real time that bias isn't only mean, it's costly. We can't breathe. We're choking ourselves out, folks. That's what we're doing to this country and our economic model. We're dying. We're dying on the street. We can't breathe. That's what we're doing to ourselves. So I invite you to look at all of this with more clarity, mental clarity, to perhaps drop a flag and do some reading and to study this. Sandy, any comments? And then we'll do really quick questions.
Just looking at the time, I want to see if there's any questions.
Okay. I see one in the chat. I don't think we have any questions right now. Sandy, do you have any closing comments? And I will too. I kind of have my piece. What's your take on this?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I just, my conclusion is that, from bias and how, it impacts our society, and just from a personal, I have many personal stories of dealing with the healthcare system, but, bias is everywhere. And so I think that it's very important. It could feel overwhelming because it's systemic, but on an individual basis, we can always help by checking ourselves and always staying curious by talking to other people, and having
Right.
conversations and making sure that that other person feels heard. Because the thing about the backlash against DEI is that people feel that they're not heard and they're getting canceled, meaning they're losing their job. So I think it's important is one, checking ourselves, how are we handling it? And two, talking to others and making sure that we're listening and going on that journey with them.
Couldn't agree more, Sandy. And I know your mom was not of much means, died of cancer under 80/20 Medicare, and was basically going to die far more quickly because of the 20% lack of coverage. And she didn't have the means to afford Medicare replacement or Medigap. But a phone call from someone that you knew to her hospital system got her a room she needed, and it extended her life a bit.
And to be clear, that, there was an assumption made that my mom didn't have the resources or that my family couldn't have the resources. And it wasn't until the state legislature called the lobbyists of the hospital. So we were at the verge of being kicked out of the emergency room, with my mom being diagnosed with stage 4 uterine cancer, to my mom being in a VIP room all of a sudden with
Right.
treatment.
And right, they didn't know what your resources were. They just knew your race.
Correct.
They knew
And
your
what,
ethnicity.
and what type of coverage? Yes.
Right, both. So I'm going to leave it here. If you have any comments or questions, you can email me at this contact information. Sandy and I are intrigued to learn what you think. If you have other information that you want to share with us, we encourage you to send it to us. We remain open and curious and neutral minded as much as we can. But our goal with this talk is to call out the cost of bias, to identify its source as cognitive distortion, to note that according to Nobel Peace Prize experts, we aren't good at this, and to really take a second look at American healthcare from a historical perspective, and to realize that we could do better. We certainly have the means, so why not try?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim and Sandy, for such an informative and insightful presentation today. And thank you both for sharing your stories. Very heartfelt. We do have one question. Is there a good source on medical benefit and claims classes or training?
Okay, so in my experience, the only people that understand billing are billers. Lawyers don't. I do this healthcare work around the country, and sometimes I have clients ask me questions about billing and reimbursement and coverage, and I tell them very honestly, I'm not an expert in that. A medical biller is. So anything that has to do with coverage or coverage limitations or what plan terms mean to the nth detail is a very good question for a medical biller. And then I'll say that ERISA, believe it or not, is a governing federal law that has to do with private plan coverage. And while it is exceptionally difficult to sue a private plan for all sorts of reasons, those lawsuits are at heart violations of ERISA claims. And so if you are looking for an attorney to deal with anything that has to do with coverage denial, you want to look for an ERISA plaintiff's attorney that handles plan coverage issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. And that's going to be it for today. So thank you again, Jim and Sandy. Thank you to all who joined us today. This class will be available on YouTube. And have a wonderful rest of your day and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
Bye.
Stay healthy.
You too.